Hey up. Now, the subject of today's video is the results of the parliamentary debate back in April regarding the government's proposed introduction of anti-tampering legislation for motor vehicles. Before I launch into that, can I just apologise for the sound quality on Friday's video? I'm having some awful problems with my video editing software. For some strange reason, it's not recognising saved changes to sound levels. So for that reason, I've chosen not to put any music on today's video. Hopefully, for now, that will resolve the issue. Now, let's just get a couple of things out of the way. This is just the latest in a series of videos that I've made expressing my concerns about our freedom of travel. Not so much at this moment in time, but in the very near future. Now, believe me, I don't like making these kind of videos because it provokes a lot of hate comments. So, number one, if you're one of those people who likes to ride motorcycles but you cannot in any way, shape or form see a connection between current day politics and your freedom to continue travelling on a motorcycle, don't leave a hate comment on this video because I will immediately delete it. Stop watching this video, go outside, get a bucket, fill it with sand, any type of sand will do, and bury your head in that sand for the next 5 to 8 years. I'm sure someone will let you know when it's safe to pull it out. Now, the other accusation that I've had thrown at me is that I'm bashing the Conservative government because I lean the other way. So my views are biased. Yes, okay, in a way, I'll put my hand up to that one. My views are biased. You see, for the last 30 years, I've always voted Conservative, much to my father's dismay. And I quite simply do not recognise the current Conservative government as being in any way Conservative. Boris Johnson is a habitual liar who has been dismissed from his occupations twice in the past for telling lies. He flip-flops backwards and forwards from one agenda and policy to another, depending on what his Instagram account tells him is trending at the moment. And he doesn't have the faintest idea what it means to live in this country as a normal citizen and the challenges and difficulties that presents. He exists in a cocoon of privilege and always has done. So, now we've got those two little things out of the way, let's provide some context for this video. This country, like the rest of the world, have faced some almost insurmountable challenges over the last 2.5–3 years. The pandemic was something that most people in living memory have never seen before. We were all confused and worried about it, so the government effectively put the entire population under house arrest for months on end, something which historically is unprecedented. Now, being good citizens, most of us complied with these regulations. We did as we were told, because we were convinced that it would help save not only our own lives, but the lives of other people. Boris Johnson told us that that was the right thing to do. And that was the point at which our tenure on the civil liberties that we've enjoyed for over a century started to unravel. You see, while we were under house arrest and we were fretting about an elderly relative that needed help but we weren't allowed to visit them, or we were worrying about where our next toilet roll was going to come from, our government started to quietly and stealthily introduce some new measures that were going to make sure we never got that freedom back again. Or at least, if we did, we wouldn't have it for long. Despite Boris Johnson barely mentioning it in the manifesto that got him into power, he introduced the zero emissions legislation. And this proposed anti-tamper legislation is inextricably linked to that. Now, it first came to my attention that there was a sort of government directive to investigate anti-tamper legislation back in October of last year. And the original outline of that proposed legislation from the Department for Transport suggested that they were going to ban vehicle owners from making any sort of modification to their vehicle. I've made videos on this. I'll try and link it on the information button up above, but I am limited to how many I can sort of link. So you might have to do a bit of your own digging. Now, obviously, vehicle owners and the motor industry in general came up in arms about this. I think the government expected that this would just slide under the radar, as had the compulsory introduction of electric vehicles in 2030, and it caught them off guard. They weren't expecting the pushback that they got. And the thing is, this proposed legislation, just like the expansion of low emissions and zero emission zones, are all mechanisms that are required for the government's end game on transport. Because none of this is about cleaning up the planet, it's about controlling the freedom of movement for the population. And don't worry, I will give you some examples that qualify that remark before the end of this video. Now, once the government or the Department for Transport realised that we weren't going to take this lying down, that we'd actually noticed for once what they were doing, they responded by calling in some representative bodies like MAG and the BMF to a meeting so that they could gaslight them and tell them all that they were being silly, they'd misunderstood what the government was proposing. Us motorists had misinterpreted the whole thing because we're stupid. Now, the BMF fell for this hook, line and sinker. I didn't, neither did MAG. Nothing that the Department for Transport proposed had been changed, it was all the same. And let's face it, we can't exactly trust the honesty and integrity of this current government. Now, what happened next is that some individual set up an online parliamentary petition expressing that this legislation should not go ahead. Now, these sort of parliamentary petitions are a bit of a double-edged sword. They rarely get the desired result, no matter which way it goes. And once a petition has been started, no other petitions on the same subject can be started, so you're stuck with what's there. Now, if you manage to get 100,000 signatures to one of these petitions, it triggers what's known as a parliamentary debate. Which sounds impressive, but in reality, it don't mean jack. All it does is it creates a discussion in Parliament on the subject, which is not legally binding, doesn't mean anything, and is unlikely to change the course of any proposed legislation. We saw this with leg protectors back in the early 1990s, where the government proposed that a particularly dangerous piece of equipment should be fitted to all motorcycles sold in the UK. MAG and a few other organisations saw the folly of this legislation and instigated a parliamentary debate. It was overruled, they went ahead with it, and it was passed into law. Why don't we have leg protectors on motorcycles now? Because it was realised after it was passed into law that it was actually going to create more deaths and injuries than it was going to save. So the government rescinded the law and quietly swept it under the carpet. But I'm sure you get the idea. A petition and parliamentary debate did absolutely nothing to stop a ruinous law being put into place. It didn't even instigate further research, they just went ahead with it blindly. Now, the problem is, once someone has started one of these petitions, we've got no choice but to lend our weight behind it. So, middle of last December, I did urge people to sign the petition, and credit to you guys, it got well over 100,000 signatures, so it triggered a parliamentary debate. Now, Motorcycle News, among others, were quick to put up a headline that we've been victorious in getting this parliamentary debate, something that they had nothing to do with. In fact, I don't think they even brought it to their readers' attention until the end of March this year. Now, I'm not going to read this article out to you, but I will leave a link to it in the video description down below. This parliamentary debate just ended up being another example of the Department for Transport's gaslighting talents. They've changed some of the wording, but it's all tantamount to exactly the same thing that they wrote right at the very beginning. I've read Trudy Harrison's statement from start to finish several times, and there's nothing contained within that statement that suggests that they want to significantly change the initial outline that they gave us. They've just changed the wording so that it sounds different but actually means exactly the same thing. I'll try and clarify that for you. Now, Ms. Harrison stated that this law is not going to be a retrospective law. Well, I should think not. I think it was the BMF that introduced this notion that it would be retrospective. I'm not actually aware of any retrospective law that's ever been passed in this country because it's a perversion of justice. You're effectively making an action an offence when that action was carried out while it was legal to do so. It's untenable. You can't legally do that. But by making that statement, of course, Ms. Harrison made it sound like she was giving something back. Now, she went on to say that the normal modifications that motorcyclists routinely make to their motorcycles were going to allow to be continued. But she didn't mention any specifics. She didn't give any examples of what are considered traditional modifications. She said that the Department for Transport, when creating this legislation, would take into account the protection of third-party parts manufacturers. Again, what does that mean? Yeah, we're going to think about them. It doesn't mean they're going to do anything to protect them. Those manufacturers are certainly not going to be able to continue in the manner that they've been doing up until now. But the crux of her statement was this: they would concentrate on modifications that would affect safety and health, which suggests to me that they will outlaw modifications which could be dangerous either physically or to the health of the rider or other people around them. Well, the health bit is an easy one. That's been a substitution for environmental controls, because if you make any modifications to your intake system, your fueling system, or your exhaust system, that's likely to cumulatively affect the health of others. So that's gone for a start. Now, in a way, as bikers, we've been very lucky with this up until now. It was going to end eventually. I think the writing's been on the wall for a long time, so I'm not going to lament that too much. We've had a good run and it looks like that's over now. The big one to think about here is safety, because literally any modification that you make to your bike could be considered a safety issue. Just look at the fashion for blacking out motorcycles. It makes your vehicle less visible, so that could be a safety issue. Upgrading your brakes or your suspension, if that vehicle isn't designed for those components, it could be a safety issue. Any modification could be a safety issue if they decide that's how it's going to be. Ignore the soothing words used and the victorious headlines that Motorcycle News has published. Nothing's changed. It's not over. The Department for Transport is not going to release details of the actual legislation until summer this year. Until then, everything is still to play for. Don't for one moment think it's all done and dusted and we've won. We haven't. Granted, Motorcycle News hasn't told any lies in that article, but I do still believe that it's a misleading article. It gives the impression that we as motorists have come out on top, and we haven't. Now, I promised that I would qualify some of the remarks I've made in this video before the end of the video. Here we go. First of all, Trudy Harrison. Who is she? Well, she's the Parliamentary Undersecretary for the Department for Transport. And her claim for fame was that earlier this year, I think it was in January, she proclaimed to the population that the days of owning your own motorised personal transport are over. I think the quote she used was, "Car ownership is so last century." She made it very clear that going forward, the government's intention is that we shall not own our own transport. We shall walk, we shall ride a bicycle, or we will use public transport to get around. And with her position in the Department for Transport, you can take it as gospel. That is where the government is steering us. That is where they want us to be. And this proposed legislation is one of the mechanisms for triggering that status quo. Now, this whole green agenda, this zero emissions thing, we're led to believe it's all about saving and protecting the planet. It's nothing of the sort. Think about this. Again, in January of this year, a bill was presented to Parliament to stop industry and sewage management companies from dumping untreated waste into our waterways. Now, I'm not quite sure of the scale of these incidents, but apparently there are 4,000 incidents of untreated waste and chemical byproducts being dumped into our waterways every year. Any government that cares about this planet and the environment would make sure that that legislation went through. Our government vetoed it. Ask yourself, seriously, is that really the action of a government that cares about the planet, that cares about the environment? Now, only last week, Alistair Lewis, a professor of atmospheric chemistry, chairman of the government's Independent Science Advisory Group, advised the government that electric vehicles were going to cause more air pollution than modern diesel vehicles, which of course is going to have serious implications for public health in the future as well as the environment. He stated that the danger is worse than the current CO2 emissions. And this is, of course, because each electric vehicle is carrying about a ton of batteries with it. It's much heavier, so it suffers much higher tyre and brake wear. And the particulate matter created as a result of this is going to cause far more environmental harm in the future, which, coupled with the dirty manufacturing methods of electric vehicles, is going to put far more strain on the environment than the internal combustion engine. Now, of course, we already knew that because I've made videos on these subjects in the past. It's something that the government doesn't want you to know because it doesn't suit their purposes. And the only response I could actually find from Parliament to his findings were that they didn't really want to do anything about it because they don't want to discourage the uptake of electric vehicles by the public. I'll let you draw your own conclusions from that. In the various videos that I've made over the last few months, a lot of people have come forward in the comments and asked me why the government isn't putting more research into hydrogen-powered vehicles. After all, only minor modifications are required to the internal combustion engine to create a propulsion method which would allow the zero emissions target to be reached. Granted, it's not a perfect technology, a lot of research is required, but the projections are very promising. So why is the UK government prioritising the dirty, impractical and expensive electric vehicle over the prospect of hydrogen power? The answer to that question is quite simple. The electric vehicle puts in front of your average member of the public so many barriers that it's unattractive or unattainable. And that's one of the mechanisms that they're using to stop the public from travelling around with their own transport. The prospect of hydrogen power, however, puts very few barriers in front of me and you, Joe Public. The technology probably won't cost that much more. It's much more efficient, it's much more convenient, it's much more practical, and it's a lot cleaner. That's the last thing our government wants for us, because that will allow us to continue as we are doing now. That's not what they want. That doesn't give them the end game they're looking for. Once again, thank you so much for watching this video and my other videos, and in doing so helping to support this channel. I really do appreciate it. I would also appreciate it if you would consider leaving a like and subscribing to this channel if you're not already a subscriber. I will of course be back on Friday, so until then, please ride safely, and I'll see you soon.